Race Remix.
Welcome to Race Remix, conversations with artists, performers, educators, and thought leaders curated to help you unlock the power of imagination and experience the impossible as possible. The need for civic dialogue has never been as important as it is today. In the U.S. and around the world, communities are facing complex problems, and finding solutions is contentious. How can art help to bring people together, to talk with each other across lines of difference, to listen and grapple with the hard truths, to understand the forces that shape civic life? We bring you a conversation with Hank Willis Thomas, a boundary-spanning artist whose work asks us to look more carefully and to act more collectively. Our co-hosts are Professors Alshaibi and Jennifer Saracino. They speak with Hank about his exhibition, LOVERULES. The show has over 90 of his works, including photography, sculpture, installation, and printmaking, representing 2 decades of a socially engaged art practice. In this episode, we learn why Hank believes all art is political, how he infuses a collaborative ethos to create opportunities for civic dialogue, and how to tap into the radical power of love to heal individuals and communities on the brink of crisis. The LOVERULES exhibition can be viewed through June 21st, 2025 at the University of Arizona Museum of Art in partnership with the Jordan Schnitzer Family Foundation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alshaibi, and I'm pleased to be in a recording studio with Jen Saracino.
Thanks, Selma. I'm really excited too, because today we're speaking with Hank Willis Thomas, a conceptual artist based in Brooklyn, New York. His work spans a variety of media, materials, and processes with iconic works like the series of photographic prints titled Branded that depicts Black men branded with commercial logos. Branded is on display in the exhibition LOVERULES, currently showing in the University of Arizona Museum of Art. Another one of his works on display in the sculpture garden just outside the exhibition is Liberty. It features the cast bronze arm of an athlete, the retired NBA All-Star Juwan Howard. He spins a basketball on his index finger, a gesture that is reminiscent of the torch atop the Statue of Liberty. So welcome, Hank. Thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So right now, we're having your exhibition right here at the University of Arizona. And I was at the museum the other day, and I was confronted with one of my favorite photographs of yours. I think it's called Scarred Chest, and it shows like the full chest of a male body branded with several Nike swoosh marks. I believe I saw that for the first time at the National Graduate Seminar at Columbia. And your mom, the amazing Dr. Deb Willis, who I didn't personally know at the time, I think I just met her for the first time there, she was presenting your work to the graduate students. So this is 2004. Were you still in graduate school then?
Yeah, I was.
Wow. Well, your mom was giving you, showing us your work, and I thought that was pretty amazing. And I looked at that, I'm like, this person's going to go very far.
Yeah, with your mom bragging about you?
No, it's because the work was that good. It was about, a topic of that seminar was about mediated images. And so I think it really fit in. Can you maybe describe that work and how you got to that project going way back here to grad school?
Yeah, so that image is called Scarred Chest. I don't know if it was 2002 or 2003. And it is a photograph of a torso, exclusively, kind of dead on, of a really chiseled brown body. And on the chest, there are, 10 or Nike swooshes that look like they're keloided on their chest. So they look like they've been branded on that person's body. And I was thinking a lot about how slaves were branded in the United States. Enslaved people were branded as a sign of ownership, and how so often now we brand ourselves with products we buy or wear or drive or talk to people on. Mm-hmm. And also thinking about scarification and the ways in which people have used branding as a way to identify themselves with community, and wanted to kind of highlight those dualities.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know about the scarification component of that. So is that like referencing in particular African tribal markers or more like tattoo work or something to that, besides the, obviously, the branding of slavery?
Yeah, thinking, but in not a specific community, but just thinking about that form of beautification.
Amazing. Well, I guess that's a good start about thinking about going back to like, how did you get into making art? And I know that's kind of probably a question you've answered a lot, but we'd like to know a little bit about how did you get here? How did you start being an artist? Or
can you share your earliest memory of art making?
Okay. Well, my mother, Deborah Willis, as you mentioned, is a photo historian, but also an artist, an art historian and photographer. And when I was a kid, I remember her turning the kitchen into her darkroom where she would develop images that she was making. And on occasion, I would either help her with that or I would be making photograms, which are when you expose light-sensitive paper to light with objects on top of them and create shapes. And I was taking my G.I. Joes and putting them on there and then bringing them to school. It was really just a kind of a fun early experimentation. And I just think because my mother was always so in love with photography, it was really critical to everything I did and the way I saw the world.
Yeah. Do you think that her also being an art historian was very influential in your creative process and the sort of subject matter you explore? And I'm thinking about, these sort of mass media, pop culture, images, marketing, that sort of thing. The sort of like critique of...
When I was a kid, my mother worked at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem. And she was the photo archivist and curator of photography and prints. And so every day after school, I would go to my mom's job and somehow play in the stacks, literally play in the archive with my friend Frankie and Hanky and Frankie. And so through osmosis of just being at my mom's job every day, where there were lectures and talks and I remember seeing like James Baldwin and Sugar Ray Leonard, and I remember there was a time when Nelson Mandela came there. Like this was a time and a place where, and one of the few places, frankly, where people from African descent all over the world felt like they needed to come to when they were in New York. And our history was being preserved and shared there and nurtured there. And so that really gave me a huge admiration and love of the archive and appreciation for it. While I don't think I consciously appreciated it, it was something that was really embedded in me. It's like home.
So speaking of home, let's go back to your beginnings. You were born in New Jersey, grew up in New York. How did that influence you as an artist and your perspective, your development?
And I also lived in Philadelphia and went to high school in Washington, D.C. So I got to live in multiple places that had kind of different nuances that I found myself adjusting to. I only lived in Jersey for 2 years, so can't really speak to that. But going from New York to D.C. or from Philly to New York, those were places where the cultures were so different. Even what it means to be Black in those places was so different. To be a boy in that time, so different. And I got to navigate myself and experience myself as a different person, which meant that I could shift lenses better than many other people who were my age.
Yeah. And then, so you stayed close to home to attend NYU or New York University.
I came back home. My mom was stuck in D.C., as she called it.
Okay. But then you go west to study visual criticism and photography at the California College of the Arts in San Francisco, where you earned a dual MA and MFA in 2004. So what was Hank like in those days?
Same weird person. I graduated from photography and Africana Studies programs at NYU in 1998. And in 2001, those programs hired my mother. So I like to say I paved the way for her. So even though I am a Nepo baby, I feel like it's been a little bit of a reciprocal thing.
Yeah, you give back.
And again, I got to go from, I went to NYU, which was this massive school. And first I went to Duke Ellington School of the Arts, which is primarily African-American arts high school. And I was in the museum studies program, which is like the laughingstock of any art school. Because they're like, what are you guys doing there? Paper mache? Read articles. And then
we have one of those. Shout out to our museum studies program.
But that's at a university. This is high school.
Okay.
Dork City. And then I went to NYU, which I was in the photography and Africana studies programs, but it was like New York was still kind of New York then. And it was kind of like waning, but it had some edge and had this really cosmopolitan experience there. But it's a big school, big corporation. And then my mother told me about her friend Chris Johnson teaching at this school called California College of the Arts and Crafts in Oakland. And I just like, that's a dumb name. And it has like 900 students. I was like, I should just go there. And because I wanted to go somewhere where I could, it's like, this is like, what do you do? Again, paper mache.
Right.
So they dropped the C because they were tired of that. And so now it's called CCA. But each of these places, again, I got there and I was demanded a different thing of me because now I'm in this full arts environment that has a craft history and collaboration is really integral to it. And the politics of New York. And also, frankly, the best thing about moving out west was in the East Coast, Black people are the prodigal minority. And I moved out west and I was like, what? We're like fourth? So I had to like learn about Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and the Filipino movement, the Chicano movement, Japanese internment. I'm like, I didn't know any of this. And I was like, oh, wow. I guess there's more to American history than chattel slavery. So that was, honestly, that really redefined my understanding of my own identity.
Mm-hmm. But I also think I heard you say that you didn't want to be an artist for a long time. Is that right?
I still don't.
But you're kind of a prolific maker from what I understand. Is it a necessity? Is it your employment? Is it just things in your head you got to get out?
All of those. My favorite thing to actually do is to build community and to collaborate with other people on what I call generosity projects like Question Bridge and the Truth Booth and For Freedoms, which, or the Gun Violence Memorial Project or the Monuments Tour or Writing on the Wall. These are all projects that there is no money in it for me, but I need to have money so that I can do them. And the real more rewarding than coming up with something on my own or even with a few people in the studio and putting out in the world and maybe selling it is meeting a total stranger who's willing to kind of open up their heart and their life and their experience to be a part of an artwork that me and my friends are making. It's way more fun to do something like that and way more fulfilling. And so when I think about my making, most of what I spend my time on is not stuff that people see, which is kind of funny to be considered prolific when it's probably less than 50% of the things I do.
Right.
But if you know anything about my mom, I'm a real slouch.
Well, I think your mom is the hardest working person I've ever met in my life.
It's like, well, she doesn't, I think for her, there is no such thing as work. She might complain about it, stress, but like I've been saying for at least 25 years, like, you don't really need to do this. This is life for her. She's one of those people who loves what she does. And she, like, chilling is, like, for her, like, taking a fish out of water. She's like, wait, you want me to just sit here? And she would argue something different. And, like, she likes to read her books, but, like, even when she's writing books, she's watching television. There's no separation. And as a professor, as a parent, as a friend, as an artist, as a writer, she's completely in flow.
I'm going to do everything in my power to not turn this into the Deborah Willis interview because, she's a huge influence on so many of us. And obviously she's a mentor to me. She's so many opportunities that she's given me, shows, experiences. But I have to remember when you gave her the award at the National Conference for Society for Photographic Education. And I, besides this incredibly beautiful and touching speech you gave about your mom and sharing your mom, that she was always giving too, right? And helping people and mentoring and creating opportunities for. I was just shocked about how many students came to honor her and the things that they said. And I just wanted to be like her. I said, I was a young professor at that time, a young teacher. I'm like, that's who I want to be. Everyone keeps telling you to protect your time and protect yourself and have boundaries. And she was like the opposite of that. She's like, I want to live a completely committed, giving life, right? And it upended what I thought I should be doing in academia and as an artist. Anyway,
And
so
how has that served you?
Well, no one could be Deb, but I definitely, I'm really glad I took that approach because life is much more filling. I don't want we spend most of our time at work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not loving with it and like committed to it, it could definitely take over. So
I'll say as Sama's colleague, she's incredibly generous to her colleagues and her students.
I learned it from Deb.
They say givers need takers. The gift is actually in the receiving of someone else's desire to offer you something. So often we think that taking is selfish. We're like, no. But we're often rejecting someone else's calling when we don't receive those gifts. And so, and I know that for certain, I can say with my mom and other people I've witnessed, and I would say myself, like you get energy when people validate you by saying what you're offering is worthy of my reception.
That's beautiful.
It's very beautiful.
Yeah. Speaking of giving, so you co-founded Four Freedoms, which is an artist-led organization with collaborators Eric Gottsman, I'm saying that right, Michelle Wu, and Wyatt Gallery. Can you tell us about Four Freedoms? What is it?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of different creative collaborations. I've never really enjoyed the spotlight. I've never really liked, I'm very socially awkward, always put my foot in my mouth, and I'm not the best artist I know. I have always been gregarious and curious. I'm not the most courageous person I know, not the most thoughtful person I know. And what collaboration gives me an opportunity to do is to be more than myself. So when I collaborate with another artist, another person, I get to be like, oh wow, I would never go out and do this, or I would never take my time to do this, or I would never keep my mouth shut here. That's what creative collaboration is. I mean, it's mostly arguing about who's right, but when you actually finish that, if you ever get anything done, it's really beautiful because the things that we do are not no one's full thing. The problem, though, is that we're in Western societies obsessed with this concept of authorship. And there's nothing that has ever been created that was not a collaboration. And I get way more credit than I deserve in my collaborations. And I've had probably 50 different collaborators, most of whom, if not all of whom, I'm still good friends with or like family with. And Four Freedoms was kind of the culmination of all of these different projects. And while I don't really, and the other thing is, I also can't stand the framework of founding, even though I think it's rooted in casting and sculpture. But I think about founding as like, I found it. There's something that feels really paternalistic and kind of colonial about it, which, colonialism's kind of cool as a concept, but like, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right because, it didn't begin with us. We were some of the people who were willing to like put in a lot of the initial effort, but I got most of the credit, sadly. But my friend Kambuila Jim, who's an amazing artist and friend, about 25 years ago, said he loved American football, and he was like, let's play football. And I'm terrible at sports, but he created what they were calling the Kambui Intergender, Interfaith, Interracial Football League, where in Brooklyn and then later in San Francisco, a bunch of mostly creative people would play American football, and it was like rough touch, but the point of the game was to keep playing, and I forged a lot of great relationships out of that. Wyatt and was part of the New York crew. Eric was part of the West Coast crew, and Eric and I stayed in touch because we were in a book together, and also with Wyatt, and talked about politics from time to time. And he came to me and said he wanted to run me for office as an art project.
That's great.
I'm stupid, but I'm not that stupid. So I was like, why don't you run? And then back and forth. And then we're like, well, we thought it was something curious about how a lot of the same people who have the excess capital to buy expensive art often have that same excess capital to buy expensive politicians.
It's true.
And it's kind of a hidden layer of that. Like both art and politics are full of wacky ideas and funny money. And we kind of wanted to bring that together, and realizing that art and politics are part of a society, but we wanted to forge something at the nexus of art, commerce, politics, and education. And we thought that we could do that by just collaborating with people we knew on campuses and in businesses and in galleries and artists to kind of just talk about politics. We realized that all art is political. Like, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to call it political for it to be political. Just by the nature of a person making something that they hope will affect others, that's a political act. And so we created what we were calling the first artist-run super PAC. Ultimately, it was technically not the first artist-run super PAC, but we recognized that that was good branding. We started in 2015, but we wanted to put critical discourse into political discourse through fine art thinking that what we know what makes a great artist is critique. Unfortunately, politicians do everything they can to avoid critique, which means that growing, evolving, challenging them is very difficult because they all have to be born perfect and maintain their perfect veneer, which actually doesn't allow any of us to grow. And so Michelle Wu was my studio manager at the time, and it was one of those things where we kind of stopped doing the kind of art, quote unquote, and started doing this, where we were like saying, oh, what if we did billboards? What if we did town halls? And we just started to like go around and ask people, would you like to, talk about your work in this context? And because as soon as you call it political, people think differently about it. And so we just went to museums, say, hey, we'd love to do a town hall about art and politics. And so that led over the past decade to us doing about, I think by now, 800 billboards across the country with over 650 artists in all 50 states, plus DC, Puerto Rico, Guam, and doing, I think, 500 or more town halls or activations, over 200 exhibitions, and really working with at least 10,000 people.
Wow.
To just really hopefully broaden the conversation and bring nuance to a political discourse. And it's been fun. Now they're a nonprofit, which I'm not a formal member of, but everyone still thinks I'm in charge, which I am always like, if they would listen to me.
Can you tell me a little bit about the title, with the freedoms?
Yeah, so I was really fascinated when we started with Norman Rockwell's paintings of FDR's. Norman Rockwell made a series of paintings as an attempt to kind of illustrate Franklin Delano Roosevelt's concept that everyone was entitled to 4 basic freedoms in his January 6, 1941 State of the Union address. And he said everyone was entitled to freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom of want. And I wanted to recreate the Rockwell images, which were really famous, of like a family eating a turkey at a table, or people from different ethnicities praying. But when I looked at these images, almost every one of these images was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, presumably. And there was like one Catholic person, and there was like a black woman in the shadows in one of them. And I recognized that the United States didn't look like that then, the population, the faith, and it doesn't look like that now. So I wanted to update those 4 freedoms for the present moment, and didn't know how to do it. And so when we were like coming with ideas, Eric was like, well, what if we call it 4 freedoms? And we were like, I was like, okay. And then he looked up www.4freedoms.com, FOUR freedoms.
Right.
And it was taken.
Oh.
And he's like, oh, but 4 freedoms, is it? Because I was like, we're for freedoms.
Yeah.
And we were like, okay. Because we realized in order to really be creative, we had to imagine that there are freedoms that we're not even thinking of now that will be things that we're for in the future. And they're probably things that we're against now that we might even be for. And that we needed to embrace duality, complexity, and not just us, but everyone.
Right.
And so it was kind of, that should just tell you like how we did things.
That's great. I love that. It also plays in sort of the way you work with language and text. It's kind of, has a very specific backstory, but
You thought it was smarter.
Yeah, no, I think it's smart still. I mean, even if we get there accidentally as artists, it's still smart. There's something subconscious happening.
A serendipity.
Yeah.
Well, the funny thing is, like, we didn't really know what we were doing. We didn't even know what a super PAC was. We just talked. Our friend Albert Ignacio, who was also part of the football crew, I called him up and asked him to make a logo. He made a logo, and we filed the papers for becoming a super PAC, which was like very simple, but we didn't really know what a super PAC was. And then we told one journalist that we were creating the first artist-run super PAC, and next thing you know, it's in the New York Times. People are writing about it, and we're like, well, you can just put a logo and sign some papers, and all of a sudden you're an expert on, like, what are you going to do as a super PAC? And blah, blah, blah. And the way the collaboration really took hold, it became, because it was like an art project. We really thought we were going to do it for like 2 or 3 months. And in the answering of the questions, we formulated what we were doing. So are you going to do this? You're going to do that? You're going to do exhibitions? Oh, yeah, we're going to do exhibition. Well, have you thought about working with this artist? Yeah, that sounds like a great, we're going to do that. Like, and so much of what happened really came in response to people's assumptions based off of what they knew that we didn't know.
So you were having a kind of a dialogue and one of those, like when you're like actually collaborating, but you're collaborating with journalists and the weird questions that they brought that push. Yeah. Wow. Truth is more interesting than fiction.
I have a thesis that the person with the question usually is the person with the answer. And so it's often, a lot of our early work was, people would say, so when we go to an institution, say, we'd love to do a town hall with you. And they're like, okay, great. What would you like it to be about? We'd be like, well, what would you like it to be about? And that, from that discourse, something really exciting would come up.
Mm-hmm. You should be teaching methodologies in art practice in class, because that's brilliant.
Yeah. How has this creative civic engagement impacted you now?
Oh, there's so many ways it's impacted me. We did some really, really cool things. We did some really amazing things. In 2018, we did this 50-state initiative, which I mentioned, where it started with, because we weren't going to we were done. In like 2016, we did 14 billboards. We probably did like 20 town halls. And after the election, we were in South Africa for one of my mother's Black Portraits conferences. And Wyatt came and was like, guys, we're getting all these really weird emails. And it turns out that after the election, people had seen a billboard that we had done called Make America Great Again, with using Spider Martin's picture from the Bloody Sunday in 1965, where on one side there's nonviolent civil rights activists, and on the other side there are police with batons pointing at them, giving them a 2-minute warning to disperse, and then subsequently brutalize them. And people were like, whose side are you on? Are you encouraging police brutality, or are you saying that, you're calling these cops racist? And all of a sudden there was like, the CNN was writing about it, and other periodicals, it was like all of this controversy. And they're like, well, people are like, what are you going to do next? So, and like, we didn't, but we really, what was fascinating was that CNN said, Mississippi residents unsure of controversial billboard's intent, which really felt like a success as an artwork, where we're like, they can put it in a box. That's, and it sucks to, what does it mean to make America great again is what the question was. And I went to, I think, an exhibition at MoMA and saw some people standing outside of like a friend, board member, and the director and the board member, say her name is Sarah Arison, who's now the chair of the board at MoMA. She's like, oh, well, when are you going to give For Freedoms a residency? And he was like, Klaus was the director of the museum, and he was like, oh, well, how about, what are you doing in January? And we're like, I called Eric, and I was like, we just got offered a residency at PS1, MoMA PS1. What are we going to do? And that was right before the inauguration of President Trump in his first term. And the billboard had come down. We preserved it. We put that up in the gallery and like started to that's when we were like, I guess we'll do a town hall. And people were like writing stuff on Post-its and they started putting them on the wall. And it was just like, it just evolved. And there was some dancers that decided to, we knew that we were like, you guys want to do something in modern dancers in space and just putting up random stuff. I do want to share this because while we were there, Peter Ely, who was the curator who kind of was assigned to us with Oliver Schultz, was talking about the history of modern art. Alfred Barr, who was the first president of the Museum of Modern Art, was an evangelist for modern art. Wasn't a thing. Right? Modernism was still evolving, and it was just kind of an idea that they were trying to prove. And so MoMA would basically say, "Oh, you want to be kind of like with the coolness." They were saying like, "This is modern art." And so if you're in Rapid City or in Lawrence, Kansas, or if you're in Des Moines, Iowa, and you want to be seen as up with the times, you all should rent exhibitions from us. And they would lease out these exhibitions to museums and galleries all over the country. And that's why you'll find some of the most amazing modern art. Even there's a Jackson Pollock here in a de Kooning, I think, in places where you're like, how did that even find its way here? And it's because these fancy New Yorkers were advocates for it. Because if you were an industrialist or you were rich and here, you wanted to be up with it. I went to New York. And so we were like, wait, well, how come we don't do that now? In a way, like when his idea was that we should be evangelists for political art and that we should think about the interstate system as our connecting roots. And we just said, okay, well, where do we know people who work at museums or galleries? And we realized we just made a list and there were like 80 people that we just came up with immediately. They were in 35 states. We called them up and were like, would you like to do a project with us? And that led to this 50-state initiative where we did exhibitions, town halls, and billboards in all 50 states for the first time. And most of the time, our only content was, do you want to do something with us? Yeah. And a logo. And that's what we called it the largest creative collaboration in the country, because it was literally just like that. Like, oh, do you know, we didn't know anybody in Hawaii. Do you know anybody in Hawaii? Oh, yeah, there's this place. And I say that because we take so much as obvious, but like, if we take it for granted that modern art came from Paris to New York and maybe it was popular, but no, someone actually came up with the scheme to make this important, because once New Yorkers said it was important, other people did that.
I'm so curious if you could put us in the room of the town halls, what were those like? And, the energy, the tenor, like what sort of transpired in them?
Well, we decided we were going to do the town halls around the 4 freedoms. So there was a freedom of fear, freedom of worship, freedom of speech, and freedom from want. And our friend Andrea Hickey, who was a curator at the Cleveland Museum, came up to us and she was like, oh, well, why don't you guys do 8 town halls here as a residency? This is like right around the same time as the MoMA PS1 thing. We're like, okay. And she put us in touch with education people. And so one example of a town hall about freedom of worship that was really profound for me was Eric and Megan Reich, who was the director of education then, got on this kick about prison and doing a town hall about worship in prison. And so they found an imam, pastor, and they brought, for the town hall in this museum, it was catered by 12 incarcerated women who were in a program with the Lutheran Church. And someone who taught faith in the prison, someone who was wrongfully incarcerated, a pastor, and it was like magic. I mean, that's one thing, like one of the women who was working, like she just felt like she needed to grab the mic at some point. And she was like, yeah, well, she basically got arrested when she was 9 months pregnant, and she had been in jail for 7 years, serving a 9-year term. So her child had never known their mother outside of prison. And talked about, she didn't have that much experience with those things that she felt like she had learned really important lessons through her experience in prison that were going to make her a better mother. And it was like, there was like, people were like, what are you talking about? Like, prison's unjust. And she was like, this is my life. You don't get to tell me my story. Right. It was like, so people are crying. It was amazing. But like, it was that kind of thing. So, and more recently, Michelle has been really leading a lot of conversation and collaboration. She did a 4 Freedoms Congress at LACMA, 300 to 500 people a few months ago. And it was really about healing and consciousness and kind of connecting with ourselves in a moment where we feel so rattled.
Right.
So it evolves.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you could tell us about Raise Up and maybe describe the work. And then thinking about 6 months later, I believe is when the whole Ferguson Hands Up kind of slogan comes into being, and how titles and moments in history, right, wind up reframing your work or making maybe assumptions that people bring to the work or the way they think about it. And whether that is an interesting serendipity or maybe it's complex. I was also thinking about the White Women series, and also
Unbranded: A Century of White Women,
yeah,
from 1915 to 2015.
Right, and it's a very specific. I mean, it is a big project along a series of work that you did before that. It makes complete sense, but that even the word white woman, I mean, that title now, White Women, sounds so different after the whole sort of Karen phenomenon we get in social media and what it might be saying, even though that has nothing, I don't think it has anything to do with it, although there might be some aspects about whiteness, right? And how that gets sold and packaged and commodified and explained, and, all the ideals of the power in which it's expressed that white women can take place. I'd like to hear about both works, but I'd also like to hear what happens in the aftermath when we change as society and how it might reframe your work. And do you have a problem with that, or do you fight against that, or do you embrace it?
I do my best to embrace and not to fight in all times. In 2013, we made a work called Raise Up, which was in South Africa. I'd seen an image by Ernest Cole of miners being strip searched during apartheid South Africa. And there's 13 men facing a wall with their arms raised high. And whenever I looked at the picture, I've always felt guilty because I was always gawking at their butts. And it just felt like it was a weird thing to look at a picture that you're supposed to take something from, but really just be looking at people's butts. And I felt awkward about that. And I wanted to make a work about that. And somehow I thought that I could best do that by making a recreation of the photograph in sculptural form. And so I kind of sliced an element of the photograph from their torsos up and turned it into a sculpture, I think, with 13 bronze figures. At that time, the sculpture, each figure was 10 inches tall. So editing the part that I felt uncomfortable about. And rather than naming it about the miners, I just called it Raise Up. I wanted to give it a different context, or give them empowerment. Mm-hmm. And it's funny to think that those men who inspired the work, not only the photographer, are possibly still alive, or their children are. Never thought about that. And so I made the work, I did it in South Africa, and that was that. And then I don't know, was it June 14th, 2014 or something around that time is when Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And the term Hands Up, Don't Shoot became a rallying cry. And in December of that year, Jack Shaman Gallery brought an edition of that work to Art Basel.
Right.
And maybe someone on Beyonce's teams maybe posted it somewhere, and people started referring to it as the Hands Up, Don't Shoot piece. And all of a sudden, I was being asked to talk about this work, which had changed context. So I was talking about something that happened, 60 years ago in one part of the country, in another part of the world, I should say, right, that seemed to be speaking very eloquently to something that would be happening in the future. And that's when I started to really think about artists as shamans, as time travelers, that we live in a future that doesn't yet exist. And so we can't be too emotionally invested in any kind of response, because we don't, if the artwork makes it out of our studio, it will likely have a longer life than we do.
Right.
And so it may take a lot of different forms. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, no, that was great.
And Unbranded: Century of White Women, I have a lot of unpopular opinions. One is that I don't believe in race. I think it's a divide and conquer strategy that whoever created the race probably had it fixed for them to win. And we are all oppressed by the concept of race because it divides humanity, and a divided humanity cannot be united. And there's a presumption that white women have a privilege. But I think white women, quote, people who are labeled or label themselves as white and women, have always been in a vulnerable and precarious place. They were not also included as human beings and were basically considered property when this country was founded. If they had any security, it was very tenuous, always. And a lot of the brutality that others face physically in their society, they had to endure psychologically. And I was curious about that in advertising, and when you start to think about, look at some of these images of standards of beauty that a lot, I would never, perhaps neither of you would never assume that you could fit fully into this standard of beauty that many white women feel like they have to in order to be enough. And the confinements of that and how it changes over time was something I was really fascinated by. So I wanted to track that in advertising over the course of a century and saw this amazing kind of evolution of this notion of femininity, this notion of whiteness that became more and more complex into the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. The work that preceded that, we have some of those works at the UAMA right now, the University of Arizona Museum of Art. Was those taken from Ebony, Jet Magazine?
That was called Unbranded Reflections in Black Corporate America from 1968 to 2008. And yeah, a lot of those, basically, and the later part of the civil rights movement was the first time that Black people became seen as worthy citizens, which really should be called worthy consumers. And so the way that advertising started to represent people with browner tones of skin was very different. And I thought I should just track that. And I chose 1968 because it was the symbolic end of the civil rights movement. Right. This was in 2005. And I just said, 40 years sounds like a good number. Not knowing that the weeks that I would first present it at the Rubel Family Collection in December 2008, just a few weeks after Barack Obama had been elected president. In 2005, nobody knew who Barack Hussein Obama was. Mm-hmm. And again, there was a moment when something that I was just being me, being like, oh. And then so in this series, I took, in that case, 2 ads for every year and removed all the advertising information. And so once you remove the logos and the copy, you start to see the image, and it's usually pretty curious.
There's some really beautiful images in that. Did you learn much about the photographers of that era, or was that hard to sort of decipher?
No, because they didn't normally aren't normally credited.
Right, not an advertisement. But also...
Todd Gray, there's a Jungle Fever poster that's in here, and there's an artist named Todd Gray, who I've known for a long time. One time I was talking, I was like, so yeah, you used my picture for that project. I was like, which picture? It was like, that one. I was like, oh.
That's amazing. Mm-hmm. So I believe I heard you say once that when you take the advertising information and all the text information out, you don't even, the images don't really relate to what they're selling. You don't even know what they're selling, right? Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, once we remove, advertising is never really about a product. It's about what ideas and generalizations you can get people to buy into through the manipulation with the text and the seduction of the imagery. And when you remove it, you realize that what's really for sale is the assumption of a value of a certain type of an identity. And when we market to a specific quote unquote demographic, we have to bring prejudice. We're like, okay, these kind of people care about this kind of stuff, so we're going to talk to them in this kind of way. And I love seeing that prejudice revealed, because if I can understand it, that really reveals my own prejudice.
Right. And I think what I was really, when I saw that work, actually, I think it was at that collection came to the Tucson Museum of Art. And
30 Americans.
Yeah. So I saw a huge number of those images. And what I was always thinking, I took my class there. We studied it together and talked about it together. But what I was really curious about was, because these are advertisements, right? And some of these, if they were in magazines such as Ebony and Jet, those are Black-owned magazines, but the advertisers are selling products that maybe they're selling to both Black and white audiences, right?
Does the phrase "you've come a long way, baby"
mean
anything to you?
I know it, but I can't place
For
it.
Virginia Slim
Oh,
cigarettes.
yeah.
I'm your age, or maybe a few years older than you, so I remember it. She's too young.
You don't remember cigarette ads, probably, do you?
Cigarette ads, the Camel ones. I remember those. The Camel cartoons.
That's the last one.
Yeah.
But what about the Marlboro Man?
I only know that through studying the history of advertising. I don't
Right.
think I grew up seeing.
Well, what's fascinating, if you the way they sold cigarettes to presumably white men was with rugged, hardcore, doing rough stuff. The same product being advertised to women of various ethnicities was about progress and elegance and being forward. You've come a long way, baby. And then their Newport cigarettes, which were marketed often to African Americans, the ads said "alive with pleasure," and so it was like black people just having a great time, and sometimes without cigarettes at all in the ad.
Oh my gosh.
And so it was really fascinating to see how one product can, what does it say about the product, really, that you can it's the same thing, you just put a different picture and a different name on it, and you talk to a different audience in a different way.
Do you think you'll ever pick it up again?
I would like to, but advertising has changed so much since then, right? Like print ads are not the dominant form of advertising anymore. While it's still popular, it's become so much more insidious because rather than corporations creating images to sell products, they've figured out how to convince us to sell ourselves so that they can sell products to us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's wild. I think that really takes us to the AI question that
Right.
we've all been interested in asking you about, how AI functions with proliferation of images that exist on the net, and whether they're from artists or they're from Instagram or whether they're however they come to be. And are you curious about using the technology since you have worked with a huge swath of popular media and images and archives? Is this something that you find fascinating, or do you find it problematic? I know even finding something problematic might be interesting as an artist, right?
Yeah, well, I've done things with AI imaging. What I feel like an ancient person, but I feel a little bit heartbroken, not because of AI, but because of what the advent of AI image generation means for the archives. Like the truth, there is never truth in photography, but the truth of a documented image means nothing anymore because there can now be images made that 95% of people will presume were authentic from a certain period that are completely fabricated. And so what's the use of using a quote unquote real image from that? Like what's the currency of that? Like imagine what AI images can make of Bob Marley. And maybe if with a savvy outlet, recreate the whole story of who he is and what he was about and what he experienced, or Martin Luther King. I'm like, what is going to happen to the history that we know in images when virtually anyone can create an image that appears authentic? I mean, sorry, it's just crazy. Like there was a thing that was like trending on social media of Malcolm X talking about racial justice and blah, blah, blah. And I was like listening to it and I was like, this does not sound like Malcolm X. This sounds way too woke to be Malcolm X, and not in a good way. Like, it just, I'm like, it's like something just sounds off because Malcolm X was not trying to be friendly.
Yeah.
And he wasn't trying to
out, I think.
He wasn't trying to he wasn't pleading for someone to care about, us as people. Like, and so I looked at and I looked it up and I was like, he never said that. But also there was no one would ever like me. I know because I've listened to his speeches. I'm familiar with the tenor of his way of speaking, but no one else would know that. And that co-option of such a powerful and piercing orator into a 2020s social justice lens to me was heartbreaking. Not because I don't support the values, but because it steals the authenticity and the power of what he was saying. Because someone's like, my voice doesn't matter. I'm going to use someone else's voice to push my agenda. who would never say that. Anyway, I think AI is cool, but I'm scared.
Yeah, I'm a little freaked out too.
Yeah, well, I think too the difference is, your work is you're appropriating images, recontextualizing, whereas AI, as you were talking about, is fabrication, right? There's an erasure of authenticity, which is terrifying.
Which photography has always been. Has never been an authentic moment captured in photography because it's only a split second of time in a narrow angle of view where with 2 dimensions, there's no smell. So I always know the photography is fake. And so I don't mourn that. I just am concerned about how people can be used in very much more insidious ways than ever before.
We probably know that that's kind of
nefarious ways.
Yeah, the current conflict about artists protesting that there's going to be a big auction of AI work, and because the AI work is coming from artists' own projects, right? And without authorship, without any attribution. As someone that works with appropriated material, does that have a concern for you, or do you feel like there's too much control and power that artists try to exercise over their work anyway?
I think there's multiple sides of it. I think artists are always going to be exploited. And the 0.0001% of us that can make a living off of it are just lucky, not more talented or more deserving than anyone else. I had my mom bragging for me, like, I'm second. I'm a nepo baby, but I think I come from a culture, a generation that kind of created the remix, right? Like the music that I became most familiar with wasn't music that was the original music. It was uncredited application of a certain sound to a new agenda, and that's basically what's happening.
Yeah, it's hip hop.
With AI, but what happened in 1994 is that hip hop got corporatized and stopped being hip hop, right? So I think 30 years later, we're going to see that with visual images. It'll be a shadow of its former self, but perhaps still useful.
Fascinating. Thinking about this idea of change and evolution, I actually want to go back to something that you were talking about earlier, the curriculum at the California College of the Arts and Crafts. Was there any sort of craft practices that were being taught? And I'm asking you this because I want to ask a question about the quilt making that you've been getting into recently and your work on quilts.
Yeah, there definitely was a fabric department. There was a ceramics department. There was a jewelry making department. I took classes in none of those. I was mostly in the darkroom and then doing the visual and critical studies things. But the spirit of the arts and crafts movement was very, very much alive. But my professors, Jim Goldberg and Larry Sultan, 2 of my professors, along with Chris, were really instrumental for me because they were challenging the conventions of photography, talking about personal life, talking about bringing text into the images and using archives. That was really exciting to me, and that influenced me. The quilts were really, I got just a few minutes ago, I went to the archives at CCP, and one of my mother's quilts is in the collection. There's a quilt with photographs sewn into it, and It's called Daddy's Ties, and it's my grandfather's ties and some of his pins from his lifetime that my mother, after he died, with some of my aunts, sewed together to make these quilts. And so I just got to touch my grandfather's. They let me, well, they said they didn't see me touch it, but they let me touch my grandfather's ties.
And that's the Center for Creative Photography, the CCP, which acquired this work of your mom. Do you know what year?
1992.
Wow.
2 years after my grandfather died. Or I don't know. That's what it says. But so family history, legacy.
Yeah, and now your work is across the way.
Mm-hmm.
The quilts, it's got a strong tradition in African-American culture. It's got narratives and stories in it, and yet it's full of symbology and the flags. Also, the memorial to your cousin, and I think you could tell us a little bit about your cousin because it's such a major impact on you and in your work. And then thinking about memorials, and memorialization. And I think about the quilting especially. I'm thinking about the big AIDS Memorial Quilt Project that really is a kind of counter memorial to subjects that people didn't really want to be talking about, and about deaths, the victims that were being erased and not being seen in our news and by our politicians, and that really gave voice to their loss, commemorating their lives. And if you were thinking about that when you were making your works.
I was thinking about the AIDS quilt when part of my genesis to For Freedoms and to Question Bridge and everything. I think about Act Up and Grand Fury when I got into branding and advertising, because they were some of the most effective artists kind of appropriating popular culture, language, and advertising to talk about human rights through the form of gay liberation and healthcare through the activism for the fight against AIDS. So the quilts themselves were definitely more connected to my grandmother. Kippy Stroud, who founded the Fabric Workshop and Museum in Philadelphia, kind of was one of the first people who got into my work. And that's kind of how I became interested in making quilts. Not thinking, again, I always thought I was original, so I didn't think about my mom's quilt. So then I was like, oh, maybe I'll make a quilt.
Yeah.
My cousin, son of Thomas Willis, was my best friend and big brother figure. And he was murdered on February 2nd, 2000 in Philadelphia when he was visiting my grandmother. And my life plan up until then had been really just to follow in his footsteps, because he was a person who was good at everything. And the narrative, I was the person who was the opposite of that. But he always looked out for me and really kind of nurtured me and cared for me, even though a lot of other people thought I was not noticeable, frankly. And all of a sudden, I was kind of pushed to the forefront in our family dynamic, because we were the only boys in our kind of collective of cousins, and felt like I needed to carry on his legacy and honor him and his kind of, he was just smooth and kind of gregarious and easygoing and cool and fun and good looking and tall and good at sports. I'm not going to say anything about me, but let's just say what I could do that I'd say arguably as well as him was love people and express that and share that. I don't think not as eloquently as he did, but one of the things that a friend of his gave me a recording after he died of him like singing on a microphone, just playing around. And it said, and one of the last things on that recording is love overrules, him saying that. And that became kind of my motto, my mantra, and something that I am often compelled to put into art form and public space, and hopefully in people's hearts and minds.
Yeah, I saw the project, the Gun Violence Memorial
the Gun Violence Memorial Project.
Yeah, I got that one right. That was probably one of the most moving experiences I ever had. And I actually took photos and sent it to your mom. It must be really hard to, I know it's you're holding him in your heart when you're doing all this work, but you're always having to share him with the public that doesn't know him. Does that feel good, or does it feel hard sometimes does it keep us?
No. I felt exploitative for the first, let's say, 5 to 10 years. Like a lot of what I was doing was based up like commodifying my own family's pain, not necessarily commercially, but like I was very aware of the relationship to like talk about my cousin's murderer. And even in some of my books, there's pictures of him or of my aunt's mourning, and that was weird.
And was it a watch or a necklace of his that
someone robbed him for nothing. Actually, they robbed some other people that he was with for their necklaces. Yeah. But they didn't. Those guys ran away, and my cousin had nothing of value on him, so they just shot him in the back of the head, made him lay face down in snow, and shot him back in the head. But now, I think about how many people have been shot and killed in this country since Sangha was killed, which is over 1 million. I mourn for all of those people, all the family members, and see myself as just a drop in the ocean of people who've shed tears to people who have lost their lives to gun violence in the United States. But that's just within the imaginary borders of this nation, right? But if you go south of this border, to Mexico or we go to Brazil, these numbers are also heartbreaking. So I just see myself as being, every time I get to say his name, I hope, I know his mother, my Aunt Leslie, she gets to remember. He's somebody that's worthy of remembering. And like, even the anniversary was just not too long ago, and his high school roommate, they were in boarding school, just wrote me, and his memory is still very much alive, and those of us who are still living, and that's fun to reflect on that.
Yeah, I understand why you use the word, the commodifying of your family's pain, but I also think you're honoring the fact that pain exists. And, as someone also lost someone close to me, I really was very moved. So thank you for that work, and thank you for sharing it. And I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for visiting us in the studio, coming down to the Southwest, to Tucson. And we hope you take your kids out to the Desert Museum tomorrow. And
yes, we'd love to have you back anytime.
Great. I hope to be back. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining Race Remix today. This episode is made possible through the generous donations of our sponsors and the efforts of our team of students, staff, faculty, and community partners. If you enjoyed this conversation, listen to more episodes at raceremix.arts.arizona.edu.